Hello and welcome to the interview. I'm speaking with Dr. Rajiva Wijesinha, the General Secretary of the Secretariat for Coordinating the Peace Process. Rajiva, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You are the face of the government when it comes to communications regarding peacemaking, peace building, and certainly in your office at SCOP. Post-war, one would have thought that the office would be even more important than during war. And it is concerning, therefore, that the office comes to an end at the end of July. Any thoughts on that? Why should it not continue?
Well, I think it's flattering that you should say that we were the face of the government in communications, because that is really not our main function at all. I think perhaps some people in Colombo might see us as important in terms of communication, because, as you know, Colombo tends to function rather well in English, as indeed both of us do. And therefore there's an assumption that the communication in English is what is most important. There's a sense in which it is important, but of course there are other elements as well.
It depends on audiences as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps one of the roles SCOP played over the last 2 years, and SCOP has changed over the years, it's been in existence for 7.5 years, was to really rebut unfair criticism of government initiatives.
Was that was not its founding raison d'etre, as it were?
No. I mean, if I might be historical, I think there were sort of 4 phases of SCOP, each represented by a different Secretary General. And I think each of them, as far as I know, fulfilled the job they were given by government extremely well. So when the peace process began, the Secretariat was set up with Mr. Bernard Gunatilaka in charge, and that was when the government, I think, was deeply committed and optimistic about negotiations with the LTTE. And I think that SCOP fulfilled its role of providing facilities for the LTTE for negotiations, sometimes perhaps engaging in what I would call buttering up the LTTE at government behest. Then when they moved on with the change of government in 2003, after the President really took over the process, you had Mr. Jayantha Dhanapala. And that was more behind the scenes negotiations, because as you know, the LTT refused to come into negotiations, but they did continue to talk, things like PTOMs, etc. And you did have some efforts, though I must say in Mrs. Kumar Tunga's favour, she was absolutely transparent about it. When money was given to the LTT, she sort of said, it has to be public, we're doing this for these particular reasons.
My question was perhaps focusing more on the future. I would imagine that the audience listening to the both of us would be familiar with the evolution of SCOP. And it was to get your thoughts on whether this mechanism, if not an institution, but a mechanism for peace building, needs to occur apace with what has been put and laid down in various policy statements on Nagarina Udane.
Well, I think part of the problem again, and let me go back to history, because as you know, as an academic, I'm determined to lay the background, is that then you had a phase in which SCOP did continue with negotiations under Dr. Kohana, but of course there was more wariness on all sides. And because the LTT was obviously so determined to continue to fight, you had to start laying the groundwork for perhaps a more clear presentation of what was happening. And I think when I took over, because that was the period at which the East was taken over, but the government made it very clear that it did not seek peace through war. War was a means of defeating terrorism, but there were other initiatives happening for producing peace, both discussions with moderate parties and also a process of social and economic regeneration, and as it were, encouraging the minorities to play their full part in the life of the country. That continues, but of course now it is a process that must be done by all ministries concerned. There is a spearhead in the form of the northern and the eastern revivals, but it has to be accompanied by work in other aspects as well.
Is there capacity, as you see it, in government to engage with that very challenging process of peace building? It is no easy task for any government. Let's leave aside this.
Well, as you know, I mean, government has had problems throughout the last 30 years about capacity. One of the main problems is that wonderfully capable people like yourself wouldn't dream of working for government for obvious reasons. And that is one of our problems, that we haven't really kept up in the way that, say, India did a magnificent civil service, a magnificent professional foreign service. This has a lot to do with perhaps some of our educational problems, something to do perhaps with the notion of egalitarianism in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And of course it wasn't corrected in the 80s when you did have a different political dispensation, but which didn't believe in capacity building as it should. I think perhaps one of the biggest achievements of this government and the last is a change in language policy to include both bilingualism, so that all people can talk to each other, and English for the country at large. It cannot be a language of privilege, because in the modern world, if you are to function, you need to be able to deal with the world.
I want to come back to the issue of language in particular, but in terms of the response to terrorism, various people both within the country and outside have analyzed the past 3 odd years of the manner in which the government dealt with the LTTE. Some have said that it is useful as a lesson for the world, others have said it is less so. I want to ask you the question whether the manner in which the LTTE was dealt with in the framework of liberalism, is it the case that a liberal democracy will always be hostage to an entity like the LTTE, and that you need to step outside the domain, the framework as it were, or the definition or understanding of liberal democracy to address forthwith and win against an LTTE?
No, no, that's quite correct, because I think the dealings with the LTT were actually done in what I would call generally best practice, certainly much better than in many other countries around the world.
You're talking about the war or in general terms of governance as well?
I'm talking about 2 things. One is the war itself, and you see one of the factors that I've kept trying to stress is the distinction between the problems we have in the field of human rights, and we know we have them, and confusing that with what I would describe as the war against terror. On